On December 11, 1941, Adolf Hitler made the single worst decision of his life. 4 days after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the German dictator stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. In doing so, he voluntarily added the world's most powerful industrial nation to his list of enemies. Germany was already fighting Britain across the Atlantic and the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Now Hitler chose to take on America too. Here is the remarkable thing. He did not have to do it. The Tripartite Pact that bound Germany, Italy, and Japan together was a defensive alliance. Japan had attacked first at Pearl Harbor. Under the treaty's own terms, Germany had absolutely no obligation to declare war on America. Hitler could have simply done nothing. He could have let the United States focus its fury on Japan in the Pacific, while Germany concentrated on defeating the Soviet Union. Instead, he chose to unite the most powerful coalition of enemies the world had ever seen against himself. Winston Churchill, upon hearing the news, later wrote that he knew at that moment the war was won. He went to bed that night and, in his own words, slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. Historian Martin Gilbert called this decision Hitler's single greatest mistake of the war. Ian Kershaw judged it more irrational than any strategic decision Hitler had taken to that point. What drove Hitler to make such a catastrophic choice? And how did this single declaration transform a Pacific conflict into a truly global war that sealed the fate of the Third Reich? The machinery of war declaration unfolded across 2 continents on the morning and afternoon of December 11th. In Berlin, at precisely 2:18 in the afternoon local time, Reich Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop summoned American diplomatic representative Leland Morris to his office on the Wilhelmstrasse. The meeting lasted exactly 3 minutes. Ribbentrop read the formal declaration of war aloud, a document accusing the United States of violating in the most flagrant manner all rules of neutrality. The note catalogued Roosevelt's shoot-on-sight order against German vessels, American destroyer attacks on German submarines, the seizure of German merchant ships, and the occupation of Iceland. After reading the declaration, Ribbentrop screamed at Morris, "Your president has wanted this war. Now he has it." Then the foreign minister turned on his heels and left the room. Morris stood throughout the brief encounter, requesting only permission to cable Washington. The German diplomat's rage was genuine, but his behavior reflected more than personal emotion. Ribbentrop had privately warned Hitler against the declaration, knowing that the Tripartite Pact imposed no such obligation. He had lost the argument and now performed his duty with theatrical fury. In Rome, Mussolini actually preempted Hitler. At 2:45 Berlin time, 15 minutes before Hitler's speech, the Italian dictator declared war from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia to roughly 100,000 shivering Romans below. Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano had summoned American diplomatic representative George Wadsworth moments earlier. Wadsworth, thinking he had been called to discuss arriving newspapermen, turned pale when Ciano delivered the declaration. His response was simply, "It is very tragic." Ciano recorded sourly in his diary that it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the people were hungry, and the day was quite cold. These are all elements that do not make for enthusiasm. Berlin, sources later confirmed, was displeased that Mussolini had beaten Hitler to the announcement. At 3 o'clock Berlin time, Hitler took the podium at the Kroll Opera House before 855 assembled Reichstag deputies. The ornate opera house had served as the Reichstag's meeting place since the original building burned in 1933. What followed was an 88-minute speech, broadcast on German radio nationwide. The first half reviewed German military operations in 1941, recounting successes in the Balkans, North Africa, and the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler provided specific casualty figures through December 1st. 162,314 dead. 571,767 wounded, 33,334 missing. These numbers, though shocking, actually understated German losses on the Eastern Front, where the winter counteroffensive was already inflicting catastrophic casualties. The second half of the speech was a sustained personal attack on Franklin Roosevelt, whom Hitler characterized as a warmonger, a hypocrite, and a puppet of Jewish interests. He called Roosevelt the main culprit of this war and the stooge for the entire satanic insidiousness of the eternal Jew. He catalogued every American provocation since 1939, every arms shipment to Britain, every destroyer patrol in the Atlantic. He concluded with grandiose self-assurance that Providence had entrusted him with leadership in a historic struggle that would be described as decisive for the next 500 or 1,000 years. The deputies rose to give thunderous applause, but among the military men in the audience, some exchanged worried glances. They knew what adding America to their enemies meant. The American response was swift and unanimous. Roosevelt sent a brief written message to Congress rather than appearing in person as he had done for his Day of Infamy speech on December 8th. The brevity was deliberate. Germany had made the case for war itself. Congress voted 88-0 in the Senate and 393-0 in the House for war against Germany. They voted 90-0 in the Senate and 399-0 in the House for war against Italy. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had voted against war with Japan, voted present on both declarations rather than cast another controversial nay vote. Roosevelt signed the declaration against Germany at 3:05 in the afternoon Eastern Time. The global war was now complete. To understand why Hitler's decision was so strategically reckless, we must examine the Tripartite Pact itself. This agreement, signed in Berlin on September 27, 1940, was explicitly a defensive alliance. Saburo Kurusu signed for Japan in his capacity as ambassador to Germany. Ribbentrop signed for Germany and Ciano for Italy. Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka remained in Tokyo, delivering a simultaneous radio address. The pact was intended as a warning to the United States, a signal that aggression against any Axis power would mean war with all three. Article 3, the critical clause, stated that Japan, Germany, and Italy agreed to assist one another with all political, economic, and military means if one of the contracting powers is attacked by a power at present not involved in the European war or in the Japanese-Chinese conflict. The language was unambiguous. Mutual defense was triggered only if a signatory was attacked. Since Japan attacked Pearl Harbor first, Germany bore zero legal obligation to declare war on the United States. The Nuremberg Tribunal later explicitly noted this point. Germany and Italy had undertaken to assist Japan only if she were attacked. The Tripartite Pact had been designed as a deterrent against American entry into the war, not as an offensive alliance. Its entire strategic purpose was to keep America neutral by threatening a two-ocean war. Hitler's declaration inverted this logic entirely. Instead of deterring American involvement, he guaranteed it. Ribbentrop understood this perfectly. When Japanese ambassador Hiroshi Oshima came to him on December 8th to secure a formal German declaration of war, Ribbentrop initially stalled for time. He knew the pact's terms did not apply, and feared that adding another enemy would overwhelm the German war effort. Ribbentrop explicitly reminded Hitler that under the Tripartite Pact, Germany was only obligated to help if Japan was attacked, not if Japan was the aggressor. Hitler dismissed this concern as not essential to the outcome of the war. The Führer's mind was already made up. However, Hitler had made verbal commitments that went beyond the treaty. On April 4, 1941, Hitler personally assured Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka during his visit to Germany that Germany would support Japan in a war against the United States should Japan attack British possessions in Southeast Asia. This was a commitment regarding Singapore specifically, not a blanket promise. On November 28, 1941, Ribbentrop confirmed a broader pledge to Ambassador Oshima. Should Japan become engaged in a war against the United States, Germany, of course, would join the war immediately. There is absolutely no possibility of Germany entering into a separate peace with the United States under such circumstances. The Führer is determined on that point. American intelligence intercepted this communication through the Magic code-breaking program. These verbal promises created a moral but not legal obligation. Hitler could have honored the pact's letter while quietly ignoring its spirit and gained enormous strategic advantage by doing so. He chose not to. The question is why. The declaration of war was made with breathtaking unilateralism. The German military was not consulted. General Walter Warlimont, deputy chief of Wehrmacht operations staff, later recalled that it was another entirely independent decision on which no advice from the Wehrmacht had either been asked or given. This was extraordinary. Germany was about to add the world's most powerful industrial nation to its list of enemies, and the professional military establishment learned of it only when the rest of the world did. Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, Nikolaus von Below, privately criticized what he called Hitler's foreign political dilettantism. At Hitler's headquarters, staff gave themselves up to an ecstasy of rejoicing, celebrating Japan's dramatic victory at Pearl Harbor. But as historian Peter Padfield recorded, the few who saw further became even lonelier. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's closest military advisors, were informed but not consulted. Their opinions were neither sought nor welcomed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, was not consulted but stood to benefit immediately. Hitler had previously barred attacks on American shipping to avoid provoking the United States. These restrictions had been a source of immense frustration for Dönitz, who watched American destroyers escort convoys to Britain while his submarines were forbidden to engage them. After the declaration, those restrictions evaporated. Yet Hitler failed to give Dönitz advance notice so he could position submarines to take maximum advantage. U-boats were scattered across the Atlantic when the declaration came. Dönitz had to scramble to assemble even a small strike force. This revealed the decision's impulsive character. It was not strategy but instinct. Hitler viewed America through a lens of racial theory that distorted everything he saw. In his table talk conversations recorded by Martin Bormann in January 1942, weeks after the declaration, Hitler stated that he did not see much future for the Americans. He called it a decayed country with a racial problem and social inequalities. He described his feelings against Americanism as feelings of hatred and deep repugnance. Everything about American society, he claimed, revealed that it was half Judaized and the other half negrified. He believed American democracy was fatally weakened by its diversity and what he considered Jewish domination of its political and financial systems. These were not mere private prejudices. They shaped Hitler's strategic calculations. He genuinely believed that a multiracial democracy could not mobilize effectively for modern warfare. He thought African Americans would not fight. He thought labor unions would sabotage production. He thought the individualism of American culture was incompatible with military discipline. Each of these beliefs proved disastrously wrong. The Nazi hierarchy shared this contempt, viewing the United States as a corrupt, decadent nation weakened by its large populations of African Americans, immigrants, and Jewish Americans. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels regularly mocked American society in his diaries. Hermann Goering boasted that American aircraft were useless, built by Jews and flown by gangsters. This institutional delusion infected German intelligence assessments. When German analysts evaluated American industrial capacity, they consistently underestimated it. When they assessed American military potential, they dismissed it. The entire Nazi leadership suffered from a collective blindness about the nation they were about to fight. Hitler also had practical grievances beyond ideology. By autumn 1941, the United States and Germany were locked in an undeclared naval war in the Atlantic. Roosevelt's shoot-on-sight order of September 11, 1941, had effectively turned American destroyers into combatants. The USS Greer had cooperated with British aircraft to track German submarines in September. The USS Kearney was torpedoed on October 17th, killing 11 American sailors, the first American military deaths of the war. The USS Reuben James was sunk on October 31st, with over 100 Americans dead, the first American warship lost in the conflict. Hitler cited all of these incidents in his Reichstag speech as proof that America was already waging war. In his mind, he was merely recognizing a reality that already existed. News of Pearl Harbor arrived at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia via a Reuters broadcast on the afternoon of December 7th, Berlin time. His press chief Otto Dietrich rushed to deliver it. By all accounts, Hitler was surprised and ecstatic. He reportedly declared that Germany could not lose the war at all, that they now had an ally which had never been conquered in 3,000 years. This last claim was characteristically grandiose and historically absurd, but it reflected Hitler's genuine euphoria. This euphoria is critical to understanding the decision. Pearl Harbor landed at one of the darkest moments of the war for Germany. The Moscow offensive had ground to a halt in freezing conditions. German troops, equipped for a summer campaign, were dying of frostbite in temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero. The Red Army was launching devastating counterattacks along the entire front. On December 5th, just 2 days before Pearl Harbor, Soviet forces had begun a massive offensive that would push the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. Hitler had just been forced to dismiss his army commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, and assume direct command of all ground forces himself. Japan's dramatic success offered emotional relief and strategic hope at this moment of crisis. Hitler saw Pearl Harbor not as a complication but as salvation. He believed Japan would tie down American forces in the Pacific indefinitely, preventing meaningful intervention in Europe. He thought his submarines, once unleashed, could sever Atlantic supply lines before American industry ramped up. And he believed that war with America was inevitable anyway, and that it was better to fight on his own terms. All of these assumptions proved spectacularly mistaken. The German public received the news of the declaration with a mixture of enthusiasm and unease. The Nazi propaganda machine trumpeted it as a decisive blow against the corrupt plutocracies of the West. Goebbels orchestrated newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts celebrating Germany's alliance with Japan and the coming defeat of American materialism. But ordinary Germans, many of whom had relatives who had emigrated to America or who remembered the role American intervention had played in the First World War, felt a quiet dread that few dared express openly. Letters home from soldiers on the Eastern Front, already full of complaints about cold and casualties, would soon mention a new worry. The Americans were coming. The 4 days between Pearl Harbor and the declaration were a period of agonizing limbo. At the American Embassy in Berlin, housed in the sprawling Blücher Palace on the Pariser Platz near the Brandenburg Gate, staff experienced what George Kennan, then First Secretary, later described as excruciating uncertainty. Phone lines were cut, cable communications severed, no instructions came from Washington. The embassy had no way to contact the State Department and no way to know what Germany would do. During the night of December 9th and 10th, embassy staff burned codebooks and classified files without knowing whether war would actually be declared. Marines fed documents into the fireplace while diplomats debated what to destroy and what to preserve. As Kennan recalled, they were on their own. The Swiss legation, which would represent American interests after a break in relations, sent representatives to help coordinate, but no one knew what the next day would bring. Then, shortly after noon on December 11th, the telephone suddenly and mysteriously came alive. A German official announced a car was being dispatched to collect Morris for the meeting with Ribbentrop. 3 minutes later, the war was official. Morris returned to the embassy to inform his colleagues. They had roughly 72 hours to prepare for internment. On December 14th, Morris, Kennan, and approximately 130 Americans, including diplomats, their families, and journalists, were transported by train to the spa town of Bad Nauheim, 30 kilometers north of Frankfurt. They were interned at Jeschke's Grand Hotel under Gestapo surveillance. The conditions were tolerable but tense. The Americans were confined to the hotel and its grounds, permitted limited exercise walks, and subjected to periodic searches. Mail was censored. Contacts with Germans were forbidden. One embassy staff member, Herbert John Bergman, failed to appear at the train station on December 14th. He subsequently became an anti-American propagandist for the Nazi regime, broadcasting under the pseudonym Joe Scanlon for a program called Radio Debunk. He was convicted of treason in 1949 on 13 separate counts and sentenced to 6 to 20 years in prison. He died in custody in 1953. The remaining internees would not leave Germany until mid-May 1942, travelling by train through occupied France, Vichy France, and Spain to reach the port of Lisbon. They sailed home on the Swedish liner SS Drottningholm, arriving in New York Harbor on June 1, 1942. Their ordeal had lasted nearly 6 months. Kennan would go on to become one of the most influential American diplomats of the 20th century, architect of the containment doctrine that shaped Cold War strategy. Hitler's declaration accomplished something Roosevelt himself could not have achieved with certainty. It unified the American war effort against Germany and made the Europe First strategy politically possible. This point cannot be overstated. When Roosevelt's cabinet met on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, Secretary of War Henry Stimson urged a declaration of war against Germany. No one supported him. The rest of the cabinet wanted to focus on Japan. Roosevelt did not mention Germany once in his famous Day of Infamy speech. He was attuned to public opinion, and that opinion was focused squarely on Japan. The America First Committee, the powerful isolationist organization that had been fighting Roosevelt's interventionist policies for 2 years, grudgingly agreed to support war, but only against Japan. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous isolationist spokesman, announced he would volunteer for combat duty, but against Japan, not Germany. A February 1943 poll would show that 53% of Americans still considered Japan the chief enemy, versus only 34% choosing Germany. The wounds of Pearl Harbor ran deep. Stimson later warned Churchill that only by an intellectual effort had the American people been convinced that Germany was their most dangerous enemy and should be disposed of before Japan. The enemy they really hated, if they hated anyone, was the one that had dealt them a foul blow at Pearl Harbor. Churchill himself was profoundly anxious in the days after Pearl Harbor. Despite his famous memoir claim that he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, historians note that his serenity was partly hindsight. At the time, Churchill was deeply worried that America would prioritize the Pacific and reduce or cut off military aid to Britain. This fear was not hypothetical. The United States had immediately suspended Lend-Lease shipments after Pearl Harbor, while officials reassessed priorities. One of Roosevelt's advisors later captured the mood with startling candor. "It was truly astounding when Hitler declared war on us 3 days later. I cannot tell you our feelings of triumph. It was a totally irrational thing for him to do, and I think it saved Europe." The Europe First strategy had been developing in staff conversations since Admiral Harold Stark's Plan Dog Memorandum of November 1940 and the ABC One American-British conversations of early 1941. These documents established that if the United States entered the war against both Germany and Japan, Germany would be considered the primary enemy and would be defeated first. But these were pre-war planning documents, agreed to by military professionals without political authorization. Germany's declaration transformed them from contingency plans into executable strategy with full public support. At the Arcadia Conference, Churchill arrived in Washington on December 22, just 11 days after the declaration. He stayed at the White House as Roosevelt's personal guest until January 14, 1942, the longest summit of the war. The two leaders formally affirmed that notwithstanding the entry of Japan into the war, their view remained that Germany was still the prime enemy, and her defeat was the key to victory. Japan could be contained and eventually defeated. Germany, with its industrial base and military power, posed the greater threat to civilization itself. Arcadia produced decisions of enormous consequence. The combined Chiefs of Staff was established in Washington, creating unprecedented military coordination between the two nations. American and British generals would henceforth plan and execute operations together, sharing intelligence and resources. The Joint Chiefs of Staff was formalized for the American side, giving the United States a unified military command structure for the first time. The unity of command principle was adopted, meaning that in each theater of operations, one officer would command all Allied forces, regardless of nationality. Plans for Anglo-American landings in North Africa, later codenamed Operation Torch, were initiated at Arcadia. Roosevelt overruled his own generals, who wanted to invade France directly, in favor of Churchill's preference for Mediterranean operations. General George Marshall and Secretary Stimson argued strenuously for a cross-channel invasion in 1942 or 43, but Roosevelt sided with Churchill's view that American troops needed combat experience before tackling the fortified Atlantic Wall. This decision would delay D-Day until 1944, but would also mean that when the invasion finally came, American forces were battle-hardened veterans rather than green recruits. And on January 1, 1942, 26 nations signed the declaration by United Nations, pledging to fight together until complete victory and never to make a separate peace. Roosevelt himself coined the term United Nations during Churchill's visit, waking the Prime Minister to share it while Churchill was taking a bath. This declaration was the institutional framework that would evolve into the post-war United Nations organization. The signatories included not just the major powers but also smaller nations like Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Luxembourg, all united against the Axis threat. The industrial consequences of America's full entry into the European war were staggering beyond anything Hitler had imagined possible. Before the declaration, American factories had been producing for Britain under Lend-Lease, operating at perhaps 30% of capacity. After it, the entire productive capacity of the world's largest economy was mobilized for total war. Roughly 70% of that output was directed against Germany under the Europe First strategy. The remaining 30% was enough to defeat Japan. The numbers tell the story of an industrial colossus awakened. Over the course of the war, the United States produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft versus Germany's roughly 95,000. This was not just more planes, it was more than 3 times as many. American factories built 86,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 2 million army trucks, 193,000 artillery pieces, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Military aircraft production alone jumped from 6,000 in 1940 to 85,000 in 1943. In 1944, the United States built more aircraft than Japan produced during the entire war. The automobile industry converted completely to war production. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler stopped making cars and started making tanks, trucks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. Civilian car production essentially halted for the duration of the conflict. Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast produced 2,710 Liberty ships at an average rate of 1 every 3 days. The record holder, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes in November 1942. Workers swarmed over the hull around the clock in 3 shifts, welding prefabricated sections together in an industrial ballet that would have been inconceivable before the war. American GDP dwarfed Germany's by an overwhelming margin. In 1944, US GDP stood at approximately $1,500 billion in 1990 international dollars, compared to Germany's $437 billion. More than a 3-to-1 ratio. The combined GDP of Germany, Italy, and Japan never exceeded half of the United States alone. When you add Britain, the Soviet Union, and the other Allied powers, the economic disparity becomes even more crushing. In steel production, the United States produced over 80 million tons in 1943 versus Germany's roughly 35 million. American steel went into ships, tanks, aircraft, and the bullets that filled them. Perhaps most decisive was oil. The United States produced roughly 60% of the world's crude oil, giving the Allies a cumulative wartime oil advantage of approximately 15-to-1 over the Axis powers. German tanks and aircraft ran on synthetic fuel and captured Romanian oil. American forces had seemingly unlimited supplies of gasoline. By 1944, lack of fuel was grounding Luftwaffe aircraft while American bombers flew unlimited missions. The U.S. military grew from approximately 334,000 personnel in 1939, when the army ranked 17th in the world behind Romania, to a peak of 12.2 million by 1945. This was a 44-fold increase in just 6 years. A total of over 16 million Americans served during the war. By D-Day, nearly 2.9 million American service members were stationed in Britain, transforming that small island into a gigantic armed camp and staging area for the invasion of Europe. Lend-Lease, which had been signed into law on March 11, 1941, expanded dramatically after Germany's declaration. Congressional opposition evaporated overnight. Total wartime Lend-Lease reached $50.1 billion, approximately $690 billion in 2024 dollars, representing 17% of total American war expenditures. Britain and the Commonwealth received $31.4 billion, enough to keep the British war effort going through the darkest years. The Soviet Union received $11.3 billion, including 427,284 trucks, 13,303 combat vehicles, 11,400 aircraft, 1,900, 11 steam locomotives, and 4.5 million tons of food. American petroleum products supplied nearly 58% of Soviet aviation fuel. By 1944, imported vehicles constituted 70% of the Soviet motor pool. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin rose to toast the Western Allies. "Without American machines," he declared, "the war could never have been won." Stalin was a man who rarely admitted dependence on anyone. This toast was as close as he ever came to acknowledging how much American industry had contributed to Soviet survival. The one immediate military advantage Germany gained from the declaration was the ability to unleash its submarine fleet against American shipping without restriction. On December 12th, the very next day, Hitler ordered Dönitz to launch an immediate offensive against the American coast. Dönitz planned Operation Drumbeat with just 5 long-range Type 9 submarines. It was the maximum he could spare from other operations on short notice. The results were devastating. American coastal defenses were pitifully weak. Admiral Adolphus Andrews, commander of the Eastern Sea frontier, had at his disposal only 7 Coast Guard cutters, 4 converted yachts, 3 patrol boats, dating to 1919, 2 gunboats from 1905, and 4 wooden submarine chasers. He had no destroyers. He had almost no aircraft capable of hunting submarines. Against 5 German submarines, the entire American East Coast was essentially undefended. Coastal cities refused to impose blackouts for fear of disrupting tourism and commerce. On January 14, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Reinhard Hardigan, captain of U-123, surfaced in New York's Lower Bay and saw a fully illuminated Manhattan skyline silhouetting the merchant ships before him. It was a gift to any submarine commander. Ships sailing along the coast were backlit by city lights, making them perfect targets, while the submarines lurked invisibly in the darkness offshore. The resulting carnage, known as the Second Happy Time by German submariners, saw 609 ships, totaling 3.1 million tons, sunk between January and August 1942, at a cost of only 22 submarines. This represented roughly 1/4 of all shipping sunk by U-boats during the entire war, inflicted in just 8 months. In a single month, June 1942, submarines sank 122 ships, 108 of them, sailing independently without convoy protection. Over 130 tankers were torpedoed in the first 5 months of 1942 alone, their burning oil slicks visible from shore. Bodies washed up on beaches from Maine to Florida. But this tactical success carried the seeds of its own reversal. By bringing America fully into the Battle of the Atlantic, Germany ensured that the world's greatest shipbuilding nation would devote its full resources to anti-submarine warfare. The first organized American coastal convoy sailed on May 14, 1942. Escort vessels arrived. Long-range aircraft began patrolling. Radar and sonar improved. The ULTRA code-breaking program gave Allied commanders advance warning of submarine positions. By mid-1943, the tide had turned decisively. May 1943 became Black May for the U-boat force, with 43 submarines lost in a single month. Dönitz withdrew his forces from the North Atlantic to regroup, but they never recovered. By autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been fully replaced by new construction. American shipyards were launching vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. Germany's declaration set in motion a chain of military consequences, leading inexorably to the beaches of Normandy and the rubble of Berlin. The 8th Air Force began arriving in England in May 1942. On July 4th, a deliberately symbolic Independence Day, 20 Havoc bombers with American crews flew the first American combat mission over occupied Europe, attacking German airfields in the Netherlands. On August 17th, 12 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers of the 97th Bomb Group attacked marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France. The daylight bombing campaign had begun. The combined bomber offensive eventually grew to crushing proportions. By 1944, over 1,000 American bombers were attacking Germany in single raids, joined by an equal number of British bombers attacking at night. This round-the-clock assault forced Germany to divert thousands of fighter aircraft and more than 10,000 anti-aircraft guns to home defense, resources desperately needed on the Eastern Front. German aircraft production, despite heroic efforts by Albert Speer's ministry, could never keep pace with losses. By D-Day, Allied air superiority over Europe was essentially absolute. Operation Torch on November 8, 1942, brought approximately 107,000 Allied troops ashore in French North Africa, the first major deployment of American ground forces against Germany. The landings at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers surprised the Vichy French defenders. Within days, Allied forces were racing east toward Tunisia. The Tunisia campaign that followed ended in May 1943 with over 250,000 Axis prisoners, a defeat comparable in scale to Stalingrad. Sicily fell in July 1943. The invasion of Italy proper began in September. Mussolini was overthrown and arrested. Italy surrendered, though fierce German resistance continued on the peninsula for nearly 2 more years. American and British forces fought their way north through mountains and fortified lines, tying down German divisions that might otherwise have reinforced the Eastern Front. The build-up for the decisive blow required moving an entire army across an ocean. Operation Bolero, the code name for the American build-up in Britain, was the largest troop movement in history. By D-Day, on June 6, 1944, approximately 2.9 million American service members stood ready in Britain. They were joined by British, Canadian, and forces from a dozen other nations. On that single day, 156,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel in 6,939 naval vessels. They were supported by more than 11,500 aircraft flying over 14,600 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed just 319 sorties in response, an air superiority ratio of roughly 46-1. German fighters and bombers barely appeared over the beaches. The Allies owned the skies. By the end of June, 850,000 troops and 150,000 vehicles had been landed in France. By the end of August, Paris was liberated. By the following May, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. None of this would have happened on this timeline without Germany's declaration of war. Before December 11, 1941, Germany was fighting Britain and the Soviet Union. After it, Germany was fighting the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously. The war had become mathematically unwinnable. Every month that passed tilted the balance further against the Reich. Every ship launched, every aircraft built, every soldier trained widened the gap between Allied and German power. What would have happened if Hitler had simply done nothing after Pearl Harbor? This counterfactual has occupied historians for decades, and the question remains genuinely difficult to answer. The case that it would have mattered enormously rests on the political dynamics inside the United States. Roosevelt, despite his personal desire to fight Germany, faced formidable constraints. When his cabinet met on December 8th and Stimson urged war against Germany, no one backed him. Roosevelt carefully omitted any mention of Germany from his Day of Infamy speech. He was already laying groundwork in his December 9th fireside chat, linking Japan and Germany as partners in a single conspiracy. But translating that into a congressional declaration of war without a direct German provocation would have been an immense political challenge. A December 10th Gallup poll found that 90% of Americans said yes when asked whether Roosevelt should seek a declaration of war on Germany as well as Japan. This complicates the greatest blunder narrative, suggesting American opinion was primed for a broader war. But public opinion and congressional action are not the same thing. The isolationist infrastructure remained potent. Congressional hearings would have followed. Debates would have dragged on. Precious weeks or months would have been lost. Without Germany's declaration, the scenario most analysts envision involves a gradual, messy escalation in the Atlantic. The undeclared naval war that had already killed over 100 American sailors would have continued. More ships would have been sunk. Eventually, some incident would have provided the spark for a formal declaration. But each month of delay would have meant fewer American resources flowing to Europe, more time for Germany on the Eastern Front, and a fundamentally different strategic calculus. The strongest version of the counterfactual argument holds that without America's full engagement in Europe, the war on the Eastern Front would have been longer and bloodier. Germany would have had the 50 to 60 additional divisions kept in the West against the threat of Allied invasion available for deployment against the Soviet Union. There would have been no combined bomber offensive crippling German industrial production and forcing the diversion of fighter aircraft to home defense. No Operation Torch, no D-Day on the historical timeline. Most analysts conclude that Germany's fundamental problems on the Eastern Front, overextension, inadequate logistics, Soviet manpower and industrial capacity, would still have prevented total German victory. But the war could have lasted years longer and cost millions more lives. The Holocaust would have continued unimpeded for additional years. Eastern Europe might have experienced even greater devastation. The retrospective judgment on Hitler's declaration has been remarkably consistent across decades of scholarship. Sebastian Haffner, writing in 1979, captured the bewilderment many felt. There is to this day no comprehensible rational explanation for what one is tempted to describe as an act of lunacy. Joachim Fest described it as really no longer an act of his own volition, but a gesture governed by a sudden awareness of his own impotence. Gerhard Weinberg, arguably the most important historian of this decision, offers a crucial corrective to those who dismiss it as mere irrationality. Weinberg demonstrates that war with the United States had been part of Hitler's strategic vision since the 1920s. In his unpublished 1928 second book, Hitler wrote that strengthening and preparing Germany for war with the United States was one of the tasks of the National Socialist movement. The declaration was consistent with Hitler's worldview, but that worldview was itself the problem. Hitler had intended to fight America later, after consolidating Europe, building a blue water navy capable of challenging American power, and developing long-range bombers that could strike American cities. Pearl Harbor's euphoria made him accelerate a war he was not remotely ready to fight. His decision was not random or impulsive in the sense of being unconnected to his beliefs. It was entirely consistent with his ideology. But that ideology was catastrophically disconnected from strategic reality. Churchill's reaction remains one of the most famous passages of Second World War literature. So we had won after all. Yes, after Dunkirk, after the fall of France, after the horrible episode of Oran, after the threat of invasion, we had won the war. England would live. Britain would live. The Commonwealth of Nations, and the Empire would live. He added that Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. He thought of a remark Edward Grey had made decades earlier, that the United States is like a gigantic boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. One final dark detail deserves mention. On December 12, 1941, the day after declaring war on the United States, Hitler summoned approximately 50 top Nazi Party leaders to a private meeting at the Reich Chancellery. No official protocol exists because the meeting was held in Hitler's private rooms rather than his office, but Joseph Goebbels' diary confirms what was discussed. Hitler declared his intention to make a clean sweep regarding the Jewish question. The logic was chilling in its clarity. Before the declaration, European Jews held a perverse utility in Hitler's calculations as potential hostages whose fate might deter American belligerency. With the United States now an open enemy, that restraint, such as it was, disappeared entirely. The private meeting of December 12th preceded the better-known Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942, where the bureaucratic machinery of the final solution was formally organized. The declaration of war on America did not cause the Holocaust. That genocide was central to Nazi ideology from the beginning, but it removed the last external constraint Hitler might have recognized. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States was not merely a diplomatic formality or a military footnote. It was the fulcrum on which the Second World War pivoted from a series of regional conflicts into a truly global struggle whose outcome was determined by industrial capacity, coalition warfare, and the sheer weight of combined Allied power. The declaration eliminated the last political barriers to American engagement in Europe. It made the Germany First strategy executable rather than theoretical. It created the institutional architecture of Allied victory, including the combined chiefs of staff, the declaration by United Nations, and the integrated command structures that would coordinate the largest amphibious invasion in history. It turned a nation producing 6,000 aircraft a year into one producing over 95,000, and aimed the bulk of that output at Germany. What makes the decision so extraordinary is not simply that it was disastrous, but that it was unnecessary. The Tripartite Pact imposed no obligation. The Wehrmacht was not consulted. Alternatives existed. Hitler could have done nothing and maintained the undeclared Atlantic War indefinitely. He could have let America exhaust itself against Japan while Germany focused on defeating the Soviet Union. Any of these alternatives would have served Germany's strategic interests better than what Hitler chose. In the end, the declaration revealed the fatal flaw at the heart of the Third Reich. It was a system in which one man's ideological obsessions, racial delusions, and psychological need for grandiose action could override every strategic calculation and silence every dissenting voice. Hitler gambled the future of Germany on an 88-minute speech in a borrowed opera house. Within 3.5 years, Germany would surrender unconditionally. Berlin would lie in ruins. And the world order that emerged from the war would be shaped by the very power Hitler had so recklessly challenged. That gamble created a new global strategic reality. It was fought out in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of Richmond, on the beaches of Normandy and in the skies over Berlin, and in the corridors of institutions whose foundations were laid in the weeks and months after December 11th, 1941. The fire was lit under the boiler. And there was, as Edward Grey had prophesied, no limit to the power it could generate. If you found this video valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. What other decisions in history do you think changed the course of the world? I would love to hear your thoughts.